Hello, everyone. Welcome to a special edition of Hometown Heroes. I'm Mike Kenichi, and tonight we're here to honor not only a great Derby football player, but an even better person. Unfortunately, he recently passed away, but his legacy will live on forever. And tonight is a Hometown Heroes tribute to Frank Romano. And it's my honor to introduce the people that know him best. First off, his daughter, Julia Soto, his brother, Paul Romano, his best friend, Glenn Gaetano, and of course, one of his biggest fans, Ronnie Leno. And guys, I want to thank you for coming on today. It's a real honor. I know it's been tough for all of you, and I do give you my sincere condolences. But tonight's really a tribute to Frank and the people that know him. And Paul, I want to start with you because you knew him before anybody else did. So just tell me what it was like growing up with Frank. As your brother and also your best friend.
Sure. I'm the fourth in line of four boys. Joe, Bob, and Frank were 2 or 3 years apart. I was 7 years younger than Frank, so that really speaks to the kind of relationship we had. Early on, he was sort of a father figure to me. As we moved and grew older, he became God. He was my best man at my wedding. We became best friends and brothers as I had grown into it. Spent a lot of time watching him play football at Maryland. In fact, quit 1 year of midget football because he was going to be a senior, and I didn't want to miss any of it. So we had an incredible relationship. Um, he had a way of guiding me and others, but guiding me that was was so earnest and sincere that you almost absorbed the advice and changed your behavior immediately. He just had a way about him, and when I think about the accomplishments over the course of time, and while they're happening, you don't see them as necessarily a big deal. But when you look back on the resume of his accomplishments, particularly athletically, he was an outstanding football player. He was, as I said in testimonial to him, that he loved basketball almost more. In fact, I think I suggested that he would have traded his time at the level he was playing football to get a one Division I basketball start. So he loved to compete. He loved to play basketball. He was a good pitcher. I also mentioned that, and he ended up giving up baseball because of the demands of the other sports he was involved in. But he had um, he was good at just about everything. And then you think about a guy that is that burly and that aggressive a football player, and he made a tender chicken. Right, he could saute a chicken, Marcella. His finesse in sports translated into his career in cooking, where he had a way with a frying pan. No matter how many times I made the same things he did, they were always just not quite as good. And I'll really never forget those coaching sessions because he never wanted to hurt my feelings, but he knew something needed a little more oregano or maybe a little garlic, or maybe just stand back and taste it a little bit before you make sure you're done. But he had a classic personality, not unlike a lot of, I don't mean to hang on so long, but not unlike a lot of good men in the Valley over the years that I grew up there. He fit that profile, and and really was iconically a Valley guy.
Right. Now, Paul, we always have athletes that when we're kids, we kind of idolize, we try to emulate. Did he have a particular athlete that really inspired him to want to play basketball or football or anything like that?
I younger years, Glenn may have a better perspective on his younger years with that. I would say that the thought that comes to mind when you ask that question, and I'll try to get you more, but when he went to Maryland, he hung out with the basketball players.
Yep.
He was in a dorm with them. He always wanted to be around a conversation about basketball. I would say, Glenn, what do you think about high school and?
Well, I'll just give you this story, Paul, to tell you about
Yeah.
Frank and basketball.
Yeah.
I can go on forever. When he was down at Maryland, he and Kenny Scott, who was another football player, a big lineman like Frank, they had a little game 2-on-2 with two of the varsity basketball players. Mo Howard, a great All-American out of Philly, and another fellow, I've forgotten his name. But Frank and Kenny took care of the two guys in a quick game. And they said, all right, we're the champs. And I went to Maryland many times. I remember Mo said, we want to play them again. They beat us once, but that can't happen. But that tells you about Frank, and just a wonderful guy and loved by everyone, whether it be Maryland, Derby, St. Mary's, a great guy and loved by all teammates. But as you pointed out, Mike, he's not loved because he's a great athlete. He's loved because he's a great person who happens to be a good athlete. Anyone could be a good athlete, but any team that he was on, that I was with Frank from Dartmouth at fourth grade in the old Derby League to high school, he was a wonderful teammate, always for the team. That was what Frank was, no matter any condition. And we won a lot of times. Any sport.
And Glenn, when did you first meet Frank? Was it elementary school or?
That was on the great 8th Street in Derby, Connecticut. Frank lived at 77 and I lived at 33. And we often played, and I told the story the other day where we played at the wiffle ball capital of the world, Jack Walsh's backyard, and we would play there forever. And as you know, wiffle ball, we're the center of wiffle ball, Shelton across the street. So from 4 or 5-year-old or on for the next 68 years, Frank was my dearest friend. And I was fortunate. And
right.
he was fortunate to have this great young lady, Julian Torrey, with him, and to have a friend like Ronnie Leno, who all different. At the other day at the funeral, one of his old chefs, Bob Mata, who came out of the Navy and worked with Frank when he had his restaurant, he said, "Boy, I love Frank." He said, he gave me a job. He said, 1 minute he'd be yelling at me, 5 minutes later he'd be telling a joke. He said, and he helped my career, and that's the type of person. He was a fireman in Derby too. I don't know if people remember that. He was at Storms. He was a fireman. So he was many things, not just a great chef. Boy, you ever go into a restaurant when he had to order food? It was like, I want the eggs 8 seconds this way, 10 seconds on the other way, and the waitress would be looking at him saying, "Oh my goodness, where is this guy?" Paul knows.
Now, Ronnie, I feel like you know everyone. You could go to Baltimore. It doesn't matter where you go, and somebody knows Ronnie Leno. But how did you and Frank first meet? I mean, was he somebody? I mean, you were very young when he played, Derby football. You were probably maybe 4 years old at the time. How did your introduction with Frank begin?
I have a very good memory being a history teacher, and when I grew up my first 8 years, I lived on Lakeview Terrace, and Glenn Gaetano was the local guy who was like the all-state football player. He made it, and he looked out for the whole neighborhood. Lakeview was a great place to grow up, and my father and mother and the whole neighborhood hung out like on the front lawn. And Glenn put together this team called the Lakeview Lions. And there's like 60 kids in the neighborhood playing there. But I remember my dad, and again, Glenn kind of took me and this guy, Joe Cafaso, and a couple other neighborhood kids under his wing. And my father said, "Hey, look, there's Glenn's going to be home from UPenn. And a good friend of ours, Frank Romano, is going to be back with them." And I could still remember to this day, and I think it was Frank's car. I think Frank had a Camaro, okay? And I remember getting in the back seat and Frank and Glenn taking me and Joe Cafaso for a ride, and we drove around Derby. So we were like maybe 7 years old in the car with these college-age guys driving around Derby. And then I just remember my father saying a few months later, "Hey, we're gonna watch Frank at the Liberty Bowl." we're going to watch him playing on, and I still remember, here's what I remember about the Liberty Bowl. I remember Frank's number, and I remember the gold M on their helmets, because their colors were really red and white for the most part, but they always had like a gold and black trim in it. And I still remember watching it. So I actually met Glenn when I was like, I actually met Frank when I was like 7 years old through Glenn. So, and again, Derby was that type of town. I mean, the whole neighborhood just hung out on Lakeview Terrace. So,
Right.
The greatest street in America, Lakeview Terrace.
It
8th
really
Street
was.
is 8th Street is number 2.
Yeah.
Or you can flip them over. They're both the best.
So, Glenn, let me ask you, I want to talk a little bit about his playing career, but you guys kind of came into high school at a time where Derby football really took off. I think freshman year, Ron Carbone was still the coach. Then McAllister came on your sophomore year. But your last 2 years, you were both fortunate to play for the great Lou DiFilippo. Just talk about those years and playing football with Frank, because I know you mentioned that his funeral that you don't become an All-Stater or Hall of Famer if him and Mike Kiley are, making the holes for you.
Well, it was a great team with great players. Everyone growing up, as you know, we used to go up there when we were in the 6th, 7th grade, watching George Busnack, who was a local guy from near Lakeview Terrace. And all we wanted to do, as you know, is to play for Derby. That was the one goal that we had, was to get out there. Freshman year, it was amazing. Freshman year, we only had one coach. Can you imagine that? One coach for kids who had never played organized football before. Coach Spring was a wonderful guy. So we played, and then our sophomore year, we were on the JV team, which won 5 games and didn't give up a point, which is a pretty good indication of the young kids, the sophomores that we were. And then Coach DiFilippo came on the last 2 years, and we can go on forever. He was just an incredible coach, person, the greatest person that we'll ever meet. We're forever thankful for helping us get into the different colleges that we went to. And he was just beyond any other coach. Not only that, he was brilliant. He was brilliant as far as designating what he wanted to do. So he was our friend and someone we looked up for forever. And we were just looking at the great dinner we had for him, I think in 2005 or 6, to raise scholarship money. And I was looking at all the names. It was just wonderful to play in Derby. And at the same time, we had Bob Skoronski, who was out there with the Green Bay Packers, captain of the Super Bowl teams. And Derby had that atmosphere. It was like Alabama. My daughter went to Alabama. Derby was like Alabama the last 10 years until this year. The whole excitement in the town. It's the smallest city in the state, 5 square miles, right? Everything was half a mile away, a quarter mile away. You didn't drive, you walked. And Bunny Bazak, who was an incredible quarterback for us, and sadly he's passed on as well. And Brent Sanford, we've lost, and also great guys, Joey Romano, talking about losing people, the 2 Romano brothers and brother Bobby. I mean, just wonderful family. And as I say, to live up the street from them, it was just a great childhood. And missing Frank, you lose a friend. I was thinking today, and you lose them. You have memories that you share with that person. And I have the 2 dogs at home, like I can share them with the dogs, but all the things that we did over the years, say, Frank, remember, like I can call up Frank, who do I do that to now? Just to say, remember when we were in the 4th grade and you were the star dancer and yeah, Frank was a dancer too. When we were in the 4th grade, they honored Monsignor Quinn's 50-year anniversary. Okay. We were in the chorus, the 4th graders, 40 of us. Frank made the chorus line. He was one of the dancers. And I'll never forget the last time I saw Paris, and Frank was wearing a top hat and a cane with 5 other top dancers, I guess. And, he was a dancer. He was, and we know he made us, we used to want to drive around with Frank because he made us laugh. I mean, he was that type of guy. But I'll tell you what, he was a player. And he was a player when he got out there, and I was happy and to be able to go see him play at Maryland in the bowl game, and just everyone saw him play against. Everyone from Derby says they were there when Maryland played Alabama. because Bear Bryant was there. Everyone said, "Oh, I was at that game." Like, geez, everyone in Derby was there. It's just, Frank,
Yeah.
Frank is wonderful. He's a great guy, as they said, a Valley guy, a Derby guy. He's gave so much back to the community. He's given us 2 great daughters, Julie and Tori, and I'm going to miss him a lot.
Right. Julia, Glenn just mentioned that Frank was talented in many things. He was a high school football player, collegiate football player, singer, dancer, comedian, all of those. But he was also a father and a very good father. So just talk about growing up and having him as your dad, because I know for you and your sister Tori, that had to be very rewarding for the 2 of you.
For sure. I like to say that my dad was the original girl dad, because it didn't dawn on me until much later in my life that perhaps he was a tad disappointed that he had never had a boy. And he and I talked about that, and he said the thought actually never really crossed my mind. He was a firm believer that everybody gets what they need, the people in their life that they need. So, my dad was funny and smart and a lot of fun. He worked a lot of hours as I was growing up, obviously being in the restaurant business. But he would be home 2 days a week and cooking up a meal and blasting the music when I got off the school bus, much to my embarrassment. And was always looking for a good meal and laugh and family time. That was pretty much my dad in a nutshell. We lived on Hawthorne Avenue when I was growing up in Derby, and the front door was always open, and there was always people in and out of my house. Whether they needed advice from him about something, or they wanted to have a laugh with him about something, or it was Glenn, who was out for his daily run, who wanted to, this is my son, Jake. Hello, Jake.
Hi, Jake.
Who just, wanted to catch up on something, or, just visit. So yeah, my dad, it's never been lost on me that there are a lot of people who are not as blessed as I was to have a great dad. And I had, as I said, the original girl dad. He was the best.
Right. And Julia, it had to be a lot of fun too, to not only grow up with your dad, but all his brothers, and just so many stories, the Derby stories, all the laughs and everything like that. That in itself, growing up in Derby had to be so much fun for you.
There was a time, that I asked my dad, why didn't you stay in Maryland? You had opportunities there. Your life could have been so much different. And, he obviously loved this community and couldn't have imagined not raising his family here. And, I'm so thankful for it, because it was the best childhood growing up I could have imagined. I lived down the street from my grandmother and my aunt and uncle and my cousins. And, we had family dinners sometimes, a few times a week, not just once a week. And, my grandmother's dinner table on 8th Street was a great place for laughs and memories and reminiscing. And again, a place where the door was always open and you kind of never knew who was going to end up at the table. And, we have a tremendous amount of pride in this community being a Romano. I never, ever felt anything but really proud to be from the family that I'm from.
Right.
And Mike, let's not forget Paul. That Frank was so proud of his brother Paul, who led us to a Who's-He championship, and then a stellar career at Trinity College, and now an outstanding businessman. So Frank was very, very proud of that young fellow Paul, and we all are.
And Paul, I wanted to ask you, obviously, he was a great football player, great father, all those things, but to grow up with your brothers, and especially Frank, how important was that to you? Because, if you're fortunate enough to have siblings, it's one of the greatest things, because when the chips are down, you might fight with each other sometimes, but when the chips are down, you're always there for one another. And how important was it for you to grow up with your brothers, especially Frank?
I can't imagine doing it any other way. it's Frank. Well, I should say all three of them. They all had different roles in with me. Joe was significantly the oldest of us, but he looked out for me after our dad passed away. When he'd go on dates and bring me, I'd be sitting in the back seat, not knowing that I shouldn't have been there. I just thought they were taking us to a movie, right? So Joe really extended himself early in the time after my dad passed away. My brother Bob was hilarious and fun. We have a core sort of DNA among us, but each of them and me, I suppose, were a little bit different. Bob was fun and loved risk. He'd like to ride motorcycles and play pool for money when we had none. He'd take the chance, and if he had to get in a fight to get out of it, if he lost, he would do it. So Bob was just phenomenal, and Frank, who was a little closer to me in age, of course, he was the main mentor, particularly as I grew up. I went to Trinity College, and if you told somebody at Trinity College that you got 12 or 14,000 people for a high school football game in Derby, they wouldn't believe you.
True.
We'd get 3,500 people at a college football game, and so I played in front of more people in high school than I did in college.
Me too.
But it was that era was Derby was a phenomenal place, right? The factories were still going. The bars were open at 7:00 in the morning because the third shift was coming out. It was an amazingly rich place from a people standpoint. And the remarkable thing is, they weren't grumpy drunks, although there probably were a few. It was a friendly place, right? People looked out for you. I would get home some days when we'd lost my dad, my mom had not met my stepdad yet. And I would come through the door and she'd smack me. Not, she didn't beat me, but she'd give me that big, she had a big hand and she'd smack you. And I said, what did I do? Because I had no conception that she could possibly know what we were doing. And, Bill Duggan Sr. had seen us do something a little mischievous up at Bradley School when we were supposed to just be playing pickup basketball. By the time I got home, she knew about it. So you couldn't hide. You couldn't hide in the valley at that time. And Frank would tell you the same. He'd get caught once in a while with his hand in the cookie jar.
I could tell you the same. I could tell you the same too.
Yes, we couldn't help being mischievous, but there was almost like guardrails because the families in town steered you back on the track, and Derby's also a place where people don't really pull punches when they give you frank feedback. And my brothers were very much direct if they didn't like particularly what I was doing. But Bob almost sent me into the next week. My friends and I were playing. We got a new refrigerator, so we're messing around with the refrigerator box. He came through the front door and he goes, "What are you idiots doing?" And we're just inside the box. He punched the box and it tumbled down the cellar stairs. And we just were laying there on the landing. And he goes, "Now stop doing stupid shit." So that mentality was very much the fabric of the family. Frank would never, like I said, similar but different. Frank would never have punched the box. He would have tipped it toward him, pulled each one of us out by the shoulder, and said, "Cut it out. Just get outside and play basketball or something."
Well, the Romano household was a fun household.
Yeah.
Anytime you walked into that house, his mom was an incredible Italian cook. And
it's kind of remarkable that Frank liked basketball. I'm sorry, Glenn, but liked basketball so much. Because our driveway was sloped. So when we played on the driveway, and that's where we played every day, it was 10 feet under the basket, but it was 11 at the foul line. So the fact that Frank was a good shooter was actually, he defied odds by being a good shooter because he never played on a level court other than when he, left our property where we played basketball all the time.
Well, the story, the CYO basketball team coached by the great Red Clinch
Yeah.
We played the championship game against St. Mary's, also of New Haven, and Frank could have played on the high school team his senior year, but he was on the team with. So we play them, and we're losing by a point with 5 seconds to go. Frank is fouled for 2 shots. He makes the first one to tie the game, misses the second, and Frank was quick. He wasn't fast, but he was quick. He goes in to get the rebound, puts it in. The game ends, and we win the state championship. And I said to Frank, "Wow, Frank, that was something." He goes, "I had to make it exciting." And what a bus ride we had with Red Clinch and Mr. DeMauro coming back from upstate, wherever we were playing. And but it was just a lot of fun, and the guys are terrific. And you saw all the people at his wake. It was incredible to see friends from the restaurants, friends from the people from Maryland that came up. It was unbelievable. And Frank was at Maryland. I was down there many times. Maryland is on the Mason-Dixon line. They were kids from the South, from the North. They all respected Frank, not only as a player, but as a person. And that was the most important thing in life. And that's what Frank had. And you saw those people with the wake that drove, some of them drove up from Florida to be there to honor Frank and his family. That gives you an indication. So that's the greatest thing that you want in life. And Frank had it.
And Ron and Glenn, you two know, being former players, Ron, you've coached for a number of years. One of the things that I thought was really remarkable about Frank is, here's a guy that played Division I football. He went to Maryland. And sometimes I think guys, when they have greatness in high school, sometimes, not everybody, it's a small amount, but they continue to brag about it their entire lives. Frank was never that type of guy. You would never know he played at Maryland unless his friends told you. He didn't want the recognition. He didn't want all that attention. He just went out there, and it meant more to Frank, I believe, seeing his teammates excel than himself. He didn't care about the accolades. And that's really what tells a lot about Frank as the person, not just the athlete, because he wasn't worried about if people were saying Frank Romano did this or Frank Romano did that.
Right.
Yeah. Now,
he
Frank,
he was understated in a lot of ways, and only by being with him on the field or knowing him did you know how much he contributed to the success of the teams he was on. But he never really looked at it as accolades. He looked at it as, we can win this together. And he was the consummate team guy for sure.
Well,
Right.
and from my perspective, my father was never sitting around and telling stories about, games and what had happened. And, I grew up going down to the University of Maryland several times a year. We'd always go to the spring game. We'd always go to homecoming. We'd always go to a couple of other games. And, it wasn't until I got a little bit older and I was able to realize, oh, wait a minute, like, he's part of something very special. And it wasn't because he was telling me about it. It was because I could see the way he interacted with his former teammates, the brotherhood that existed between them. And again, they weren't sitting around talking about the games they had won and the amazing experiences that they had together. It was more of just that they loved being together and they were bonded by this experience. And, again, it wasn't something that my father would have ever told me himself. I figured it out purely on my own.
Right.
Well, he had friends. Again, they would get on the phone, and Paul Villano, whose family I said came up from Florida, they would have more laughs than you can imagine. If you ever got in a car, and they were wonderful friends. They were like Derby friends. And Frank was part of that at Maryland. And that's the greatest honor, that you can go somewhere and have an influence. Frank's freshman year, you couldn't play varsity ball then. Their varsity team was awful. They were 2-9. By Frank's senior year, they were in a bowl. They were in the Peach Bowl. Okay. Frank was down there. And there was a book actually written about Frank's incoming freshman class and how they changed the culture at Maryland, how they made it positive, and they won games too. I mean, they won the Atlantic Coast Conference. They played Tennessee in the Liberty Bowl, Georgia in the Peach Bowl. And to be part, as Julia said, just to be part of that. And she experienced it with like Kenny Scott. He's Uncle Chopper. That's how close they are. And the kids, it was just great to be able to, those people would come to Derby and we all knew them.
Yeah.
Paul Villano, Kenny Scott, Bart Purvis, just wonderful, wonderful friends. And Frank had the greatest experience. And Coach DeFilippo knows what a player is. He knew, he said, yeah, Frank, go to Maryland. He told Maryland that. He wouldn't send anyone down there who couldn't play. You think Coach would do that? And he knew. Forget All-State, that doesn't mean anything. When your coach, like Coach Flippo says, well, we couldn't have too many guys on the All-State team. They wouldn't allow it. But we were going to take an All-State picture. Coach Flippo said, boy, I wish I could take Frank and Gary Pazuzak down with me and have them go one-on-one and see who the other players should be. But Frank didn't care about that. He just cared about one thing, his teammates and winning and having fun. They talk about the Romano boys. They were hilarious. They were couldn't beat them. I mean, they were a good foursome. I was thinking the other day, Paul, Joey left recently, Paul Villano left recently, Bobby's up there, and Frank. Can you imagine the four of them up in heaven just telling jokes about they were just wonderful people.
Yeah,
I think they're telling jokes and they're eating.
Yeah,
I think they're telling jokes and they're eating.
I hope they're focused on the game tonight. That's what I'm hoping. The NCAA game, Maryland, Florida. That's what we're worried about tonight.
Winner for Frank
and Ronnie. And Ronnie, you know him as well as these guys do, and you know the type of person he is. And one thing I don't pretend to know him as well as everybody else did, but anytime I would talk to people that spoke so highly of him, the one thing was the constant thing is that he was a true friend. And if you didn't like Frank, you didn't like people. That's what I always heard. And that's what he was. And I don't think there's anybody anywhere that could say a bad thing about him.
No, Frank was one of the most special people. And when he passed, I posted on Facebook. And to me, like Glenn said it, you could be All-State, all this, all pro, Canton Hall of Fame, this and that. To me, the most important part was that he was a Hall of Famer in life. Okay. And it was a testament to his friendship to people. How many people showed up at his wake from so many miles away and at his funeral, and you name it, everybody loved Frank. And I was lucky enough. So when I met him when I was 7, and then by the time I get to high school, one of my best friends in high school, Marco Rumbin, Marco introduced me to Frank. And he said, look, you can get a job as a dishwasher here with me too at Romano's restaurant. And everybody knew Romano's because we had our banquets there and the food was so good. And I was like, I can be a dishwasher? And he goes, yeah. And I thought it was the biggest thing in the world. And I still remember Paul working the fry later. Okay. Stevie, Frank's wife, and Linda working as waitresses, and Joe working the front, and Pauline working. And I still remember I would work with a fork in my back pocket. And Marco and I would nibble at some of the food as it was coming in from outside. We didn't care about that stuff. And Frank said to me, you're the absolute worst dishwasher I've ever had, but I'm keeping you because you make me laugh. And I said, okay, I'm glad I could do that. And what I did love being a history teacher is I would get off work, say 11:30, but I would hang around to 1, A, because I had a messed up family life, but B, I would just sit there and listen to his stories. And I was lucky enough to transcend from when I went to high school, and I got so much advice from Frank. And then I became a teacher, and then I taught his daughters. So I was lucky enough to go from the old generation to the new generation. And I was embedded in the community and a lot of different things. And it was great. It was great. I had Julia and Tori in class. I always thought that I gave them, all my kids, the right to freedom of speech and ideas. And it was great teaching at Derby. Charlie DeCenzo was the principal. It was a great time to be at Derby still. And the only thing I'll ever give Hillary Clinton credit for, because we won't go there with Hillary Clinton, but she did say one thing that was so true. It takes a village. And you know what? Derby was the village. And I had people like Glenn, like Paul, like Frank. I had so many people, Lou DiFlippo, Charlie DiCenzo. I could go on and on. I had people that, again, when I was having a problem at home, I looked at them for stability and advice. And that's what I was lucky to get from them. And, here I am, I'm 5 or 6 years away from retiring. And I said to myself, holy cow, I can't believe that we've come almost full circle here. And then when I was losing weight, Julia was the reason why I lost all the weight. I walked every day with Julia, and she told me a bunch of stories, and I laughed. And when you're laughing, you're losing more weight too. Okay.
It's one of the benefits of COVID.
Correct.
Mike,
Julia,
how's your dad doing? Still running?
No, he's, believe it or not, Glenn, he got the multiple myeloma last summer. So he's recovering from that. I think he hopes to run in the summer, but that's been like a long recovery, but he's hanging in.
He put in some miles, I'll tell you.
Oh yeah. He would have ran if he didn't get these symptoms, but
great guy, great Derby guy as well.
Yeah, thank you for asking. Julia, let me ask you. Yeah, definitely. Julia, let me ask you, as great of a father as he was, his pride and joy was being a grandfather as well. And I know that he would say many times that kept him young, that kept him going. So talk about Frank Romano, the grandfather, a little bit.
Yeah. When I got pregnant with my first child, my son, Jake, there was obviously a ton of excitement from him about a boy. And then obviously Talia came 2 years later, and he was just as excited and was very familiar and comfortable around a baby girl. So he knew exactly what to do. He was really invested in them actually in sports. He was always interested in knowing what they were doing and coming to games when he was well enough to do so. He would call my son Jake after every basketball game. This past season, my son goes to Assumption School in Ansonia and plays basketball there. So my father was always very interested, given his love for CYO basketball. When he was well enough, he would come down to the beach with us in Ocean City, Maryland, which was my father's second favorite place to be, for sure. I always say that it was, College Park, Maryland is where my father was always the happiest and the most relaxed. Second was Ocean City, Maryland, and then his hometown, obviously, of Derby, Connecticut. But he just was a natural grandfather, and as he was a father, because my father was always, when he, granted, when he was not well, the years got a little bit more difficult. And as Glenn said, he got a little bit more ornery around things like egg temperature. But up until that point, he was very easygoing, always very easy to talk to. I always say he was the most non-judgmental person you'd ever met in your entire life. If I would say something about someone that perhaps was maybe a little unkind, he would always discipline me no matter how old I was. To understand and to remember that you never know what someone else is going through. You never know the load that they're carrying. And, he just was, the best that way. And I think he definitely impressed that upon my children as well, now that they're almost 13 and 11.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
That's one of our common DNA kind of things, where we generally are gentle, but we're a real pain about detail.
Yeah.
So,
if you attended Frank's funeral, you would realize that the details matter to us.
Oh yeah.
And Paul, I was thinking about this when you brought it up before. You got to really give your mom a lot of credit, because when you have 4 boys, you have to be tough by necessity. There's no other choice. So I'm sure, as tough as you boys were, she was the one person you were afraid of in life.
It's so true. We were. She stared us down. Bob probably pushed her the most. Frank, I wouldn't say surrendered the fastest, but he because of his place at the time my dad passed away, he was just generally wanted to help my mother all the time. So he was always very conscious of not making things harder for her. Bob felt like it was okay to make things a little harder for her. And I just followed around. I was little. I mean, I was 7, 8, 9 years old at the time. But my mother had an incredible way of standing you down. Here's what she did do with Frank. When he was being a nuisance, she would softly touch his ear, and he would look up at her, and she'd say, "You have to go to the bathroom, don't you, Frankie?" And she'd hold on to his ear as they walked to the bathroom, and then she'd twist it and squeeze it a little bit and say, "When we go back out there, you're going to be respectful." And she broke him like all of us, and I don't think broken is a bad thing. I think getting the sort of risk-taking, irresponsibleness out of young people is a good thing. What you don't want to do is damage their spirit, and we know that it didn't damage the spirit of Frank, or my other brothers for that matter. But he was very conscious of other people's feelings all the time, all the time. And I think it was one of the reasons you felt comfortable going to him when you had a problem, because he didn't, as Julia said, he didn't judge you. He listened. Sometimes he'd look at you with a little askance, with a, "I don't know, if you don't really have a leg to stand on with this one," or he'd empathize if he felt that was the right answer. But you never left feeling worse. You left feeling better informed, or like somebody loved you, and maybe that's all you need to do sometimes.
Frank
Certainly was true for him.
Frank was liked across all pieces, the high school, the kids who were shop kids, the kids who were class top students. He was kind to all the people, and that existed throughout the rest of his life, which made him so well liked. Whether you were the president of the company or the janitor, he just was the same to any of you. And
He'd be the guy that would know the name of everybody who worked in the locker room, right?
Yeah.
He'd stop and talk to you. He knew you never forgot your name. He made sure he appreciated everybody for what they brought to the table, and it's a remarkable capability that I don't think you purposely develop. It just becomes part of your character if you're surrounded by the right things and
being your mother,
and wired decently. Yes.
Your mother did a wonderful job with the 4 brothers.
Yes, and you can't. My dad loved us. Was gone while we were young. We can't have a conversation like this completely without acknowledging our stepdad. Ed Conti was phenomenal. My mother always says, "Some people can't find one good husband. I found 2." So she really felt supported, and he took on 4 boys when we weren't out of the house at the time. So he had the restaurants. He kept us going in that business in a lot of ways, and helped us to another wildly practical, common sense guy, much like my mom, much like my dad. He too would look at you and say, "What are you doing that for?" And you'd look up at him, and I feel like Frank would put him, right at the top, not the very top because of my mom, but he put him at the top of people who influenced and who he respected the most.
And he was always at the restaurant. He was always there. And Eddie was another one, just a straightforward guy. They were great role models, all of those guys. And I was lucky enough that when I was in high school and early in college, Romano's was going full tilt. And then by the time I finished up at Central Connecticut, they had the restaurant in Southington. So I brought numerous people from Central Connecticut always down to brag about and then to meet Frank. And so a lot of my college friends, when Frank passed, they had remembered it. And at least 10 to 15 of my college friends, we remember Frank. We remember going to both restaurants. And so I remember it was easier for me to go from New Britain to Southington when they had Conti's down on the corner of Queen Street, and I forgot whereabouts where it was over there. Yeah. But I used to go my freshman year. We'd bring them to Romano's. My sophomore year to Romano's, and then then all of a sudden they moved up to Southington, And then I say, oh, we only got a 10-minute drive to go to Southington, and we'd go there. So, and I bragged about Frank, and it was one of those things that I want you to meet my buddy, one of my mentors. And I would, of course, many of my friends, I would bring just to the restaurant to meet the whole family, because they were still mostly involved at that time.
And I think, guys, one of the things that really stands out about Frank is the fact that here he went to Maryland, he played Division I football, but he never forgot where he came from. He came back to Derby. He raised his kids in Derby. Derby was his first love. You know, that's what says a lot about him. And that's really what exemplifies who he is as a person, because he loved his town. And the other thing, and I keep going back to it, is he was never about Frank Romano. He was about everybody else. He wanted Glenn Gaetano to succeed more than him. He wanted Jay Hemstock to succeed more than him. You know, he wanted his friends to do well, and he just wanted to be there. And that's all he cared about. There was no, you know, he wasn't full of himself. He did not look back on his athletic accomplishments like that.
Nope.
He was just a friend and a great teammate. And probably, I said in the opening, the pride of the Red Raiders, I think he really was the pride of the Derby Red Raiders, because he really embodied what pride meant.
Well, I'll just give you one last example. Frank's senior year, Maryland invited Alabama to start the season at College Park. And Bear Bryant said, I'll bring my team up. It'll be a good time to see the Capitol and a good starting way to begin the season, an easy game. And he walks into Maryland, and there are 54,000 people at Byrd Stadium. And two people walk out who are the co-captains of Maryland, Frank Romano and Randy White, who later went on to become the Super Bowl MVP and a Hall of Famer. And they were the two players chosen by their teammates to represent the team in the biggest game at Maryland in 20 years. And there was so much pride that we had that Frank was out there, and not that he was out there, but and I said many people from Derby were at that game, and it was a wonderful football game. Unfortunately, we lost by 5, but it just gives you the example of what his teammates thought of him, to have him out there representing the entire university against Alabama, which Roll Tide, of course. Yeah, my daughter went to Alabama, so if I say Alabama, Ronnie, what would you say? Alabama.
You Roll Tide.
Okay, thank you.
But I will say there were 2 facts of that game that he did tell me. And one was, it was the first time that the University of Maryland had put extra bleachers into Byrd Stadium because there were so many people at that game. So my dad actually has an aerial shot of that game that he sort of found by accident. And you can see that they put temporary bleachers at the top of the stadium for people to come. And the second fact that he told me about that game was that when they went out for the coin toss, he was shaking so bad, because when Mike, you had asked earlier about his influences through high school and college, if there was people that he had looked up to. And he said that, you know, Bear Bryant was just the epitome of college football. And it was just, he could not believe that he was standing so close to Bear Bryant. And he had turned to Randy White and said, I can't talk and I can't do, like, I can't touch anything, because he said he was shaking so bad because he was so close to Bear Bryant.
And let's not forget Barry McDermott, who was on the sideline with Bear Bryant. Barry loved Alabama, and somehow he got on the sideline for the game.
You know, Julia, with everything in his life, to be a great football player, he had to work. He had to work hard. He had to dedicate himself. But probably the greatest attribute you can make about him is how he fought to live, because he really did. And
he really did.
You really have to think about that in a lot of ways. He kept fighting because he knew he had 2 daughters, he had grandkids, and that in itself was enough to live for. And it made everything that he went through worth it, even if it was a struggle. So although, like I said, tremendous athlete, his will to live and to fight to live is really, again, like I said, his greatest accomplishment in life.
Unmatched, in my opinion. It was very difficult at the end for all of us. But he he did not know how to quit. It was just not in his DNA. And there had been several moments between he and I where I sort of, looked at him and said, what do you want to do? And he just would not have the conversation because he didn't know how to give up, and he wasn't going to start now. That was really who he was. And another story that he had told me, one of the very few, was he was at a practice when he was at Maryland, and he said it was August and it was hot and it was full pads. And he said in those days, he goes, there was no water breaks, and there was nobody cared if you were tired. And the coaches were making them jump the stairs of the stadium. And he had had it. And he, in his first 2 years, he didn't really gel well with the coaches, and he just was having a really hard time. And he said, that's it. And he walked out of the stadium, and he got into his car, took his uniform off, and he got into his car, and he said he drove around the Beltway, Washington, D.C. for 45 minutes. And he said the only thing he could think about was all of the guys from the Valley who had gone to big schools, who had gone to programs, who quit because it was hard. And it was not only hard physically, but it was hard mentally. And it didn't necessarily matter who you were or where you came from or who your parents were, And so he said he drove back to practice, and he said he walked back on the field, and he said no one even noticed that he was gone. So he just got back into practice, and nobody ever knew it, but he said, I quit the team for a whole 45 minutes, but he loved to tell that story. But ultimately what you take away from it is that Frank wasn't a quitter, and he didn't quit then, and he definitely wasn't going to quit now.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Julie and Tori were wonderful, wonderful daughters. And his brother Paul, to the support they gave him. As you mentioned, Mike, it wasn't easy for Frank over the last several years. And only Julie and Tori know what they did for their dad. And they certainly would do it again. But it wasn't easy for them. It wasn't easy at all. And she said, Frank is up there with Joey, Bobby, and Paul Villano, and whatever they're doing up there, I'm sure they're having fun.
No, they're not watching the game right now, which is aggravating me a little bit.
One of the things I wanted to ask you all before we go, and I'll start with you, Ron, is how impactful was Frank in your life? I mean, because clearly you met him at 7 years old, and all these years later, 50 some odd years later, that impact has never left you. So talk about the impact that he left with you.
I could say it really in one sentence. I'm a better person because of Frank Romano. He truly was one of my mentors, and when he passed away, it was one of the saddest days of my life. And I've had a very good life, but he made it. He embellished my life. He made my life better because he was always available to talk. How many times Julia said I still remember on Hawthorne Ave, the front door was always open. So many times I would just pull my car right over, jump out, and walk right into the house. So I'm a better person because Frank was my mentor, and I'm a better person because of him.
Glenn, I know what kind of teammate he was to you, but you can't match what he was as a teammate to what he was as a friend. I mean, maybe you could a little bit, but his friendship to you had to be so much more. Talk about the impact he's had on you your entire life.
Well, we've been best of friends since 8th Street. And I was just thinking yesterday, you lose a dear friend and you lose a lot of memories. You have the memories, but all the memories, and they were wonderful memories of everything. And to not being able to call up Frank and talk about something as we did for many, many years, already within 1 week, you have that impact and you'll find out I'm 72 now. Frank would have turned 73, I think, yesterday. If you have a friend like that for years, and as you get older, you lose friends, and it's difficult, it's impossible to replace the times and the memories that we have shared. And I am certainly going to miss that. And that's the way it's going to be. That's life. You have to move on. But as our good friend Colleen Marin, who lives in Florida and went to high school with us, said, just remember the wonderful times that we had with Frank, not the fact that he was ill the last couple of years, and just be appreciative of what we had with him. And that's what I think.
Right. Paul, you obviously, losing a brother is one of the worst things, losing a sibling. But I mean, again, you knew him before anybody else did here. And I mean, the years you had together, growing up together, all of that. I mean, you can never put, a price tag on any of that. So talk about not only the impact he had on you as a brother, but also as somebody that you looked up to.
Wow. Um, that's an easy question, but a hard one to answer without breaking up a little bit here. What would I say? I certainly would not be who I am today without the influence of Frank.
Right.
He created a lot of special circumstances. I mean, on top of being a fabulous brother and friend, his success took us to places that we never would have been. Never. And he was joyful
Right.
in knowing that the whole family was going to benefit from what he accomplished in Maryland and what he accomplished, after Maryland and what he did with the restaurant career that he chose to get involved in. So I think of you much like in It's a Wonderful Life. You can't, the movie, of course. There's no accounting for taking someone out of the lives of others and being able to describe what it would have been like without him. He was incredibly influential with everyone, but he took particular interest in me.
Right. And Julia, I mean, he was the first man you loved in your life, let's be honest. And, that love never stopped, and it's always going to be there. And, I know myself what it's like to lose a parent. It's, believe me, you never get over it. But
Yeah.
just talk to me about not just obviously the impact he had on you as a father, but just your everyday life, the lessons he taught you. What would you say was the biggest impact he had?
I would say to some extent to not take myself and everything so seriously, that everything it will work out the way that it's supposed to take a deep breath. You're going to be fine. He gave me tremendous amount of confidence in being a mother. He was always very, very good at checking in on me. When I, had both of my children, everybody ran to the hospital to see the babies, right? Which is, of course, what should happen. But my father was at the hospital to see me, and to make sure that I was okay and that, that I was doing okay, and was always checking in on me. I had talked about at the funeral, some of the greatest gifts that he gave me. And, I said that they were laughter, they were friendship, and unconditional love. And those, will always be the three greatest gifts that he gave me. And the gift of friendship, I had said that he taught that the importance of being and receiving friendship, he did that by example. However, the dynamic between my father and I was always parent and child, even when sort of things got a little bit backwards in terms of his health was really declining. It was still very clear that he was the father and I was the child. I could not tell him what to do, but we were very good friends. My father respected me as a person, as an adult, and he, gave me his friendship, I think, without even really meaning to, because again, he was my dad and that was clear, but he was also my best friend. And I was so fortunate to have him.
Right. Again, guys, I didn't know him well, obviously, but I have never, like I said, anybody that's ever been close with him and who really knows him for who he is has ever said anything negative about him. It's always just been, the same thing. Frank was about others first and himself last, and that's how it always was. And it just shows tonight from talking to all of you is, like I said, the impact he's made on all of you. But that in the end, Frank really was the ultimate teammate, the ultimate father, the ultimate son, ultimate athlete, ultimate grandfather, everything, and friend. He loved everybody first and himself last, like I said. And that's really what his legacy will be is Frank Romano was about his family and friends first and Frank Romano last. That's how I look at it. And I really do appreciate all of you giving me some time today and sharing these great stories.
Thank you, Mike. This is so
you
nice.
do a
Thank you,
very
Mike.
good job, Mike.
Appreciate it, Mike.
Very much. And
Thank you, guys.
Thanks,
Glenn,
Mike. Thank you, guys.
Glenn, I figured it would be fitting for you to kind of wrap this up and just kind of end the show with if you had to sum up Frank Romano in a few words or even a few sentences, how would you sum up his life and the person he is?
a great son, brother, father, friend, chef, fireman, dancer, and just the one person that you'd want to have on any team or activity you were doing. You wanted Frank with you, and you'll get some laughs out of it too. He's
Right.
He's a legend. He's again from Maryland up to our good friend from Maine just called today, and Carmen Sanford, Brent's sister, said, "Oh, I love Frank," and just all these people that you met at the wake saying, "I haven't seen Frank in years," and that's what else can you say? They tell us they tell us how much Frank meant to all of them. Like Paul said, it's wonderful. He gave something to everyone, and we're gonna take it with us. We're gonna
Right. That's really nice, Glenn. It's great for you to say. Folks, I'll just end it on this more than anything else. You could talk about what a great athlete he was, and he played Division I, big time Division I college football, and he excelled at it, and he was a success at it. But if the legacy of a man is based on the lives he's touched and the people he's loved, then a big piece of Frank Romano will live on in all of us. For Hometown Heroes, I'm Mike Kenichi saying good night, everyone.
Good night,
Good
Mike.
night, Mike.
Good night.
Good night, Mike.